The area of focus that I chose for my Missional Helix project is disciple making. The reason that I chose that is because I really wanted to practice applying the Missional Helix model to my current ministry context, which is Denver, Colorado. Um, the more that I learned about the Missional Helix this semester, the more intrigued I was, and but also kind of the more confusing it got. And so a lot of times for me, and the way I learn things is just by doing it. And so I thought it would just be really helpful to just like take this model and ask the questions that it asks of my own context and of my own ministry model that I'm in right now. I'm on staff at a church here in Denver. And it was a really fruitful exercise for me. And so, what I want to do in this presentation is just kind of walk you guys through some of the questions that I'm asking of my context, and then how that then informs just our ministry practices and models and strategies. So, we'll start with theological reflection. And kind of the question that we're asking here is, what theological convictions necessitate disciple making? I know that's kind of a loaded question. I know it's pretty broad, and you can spend a lot more than 15 minutes just talking about all of the theological convictions that kind of necessitate disciple making. But as I thought about it, I kind of wanted to distill it all into just a simple, memorable, I guess, outline. And so, as I think about those theological convictions, the first one would be the gospel. Seems pretty obvious, but when I say the gospel, what I'm saying is that believers are saved and sanctified by believing the gospel message. And kind of the emphasis there is that we're not just saved by the gospel, but we're also sanctified by the gospel. And I think that sometimes gets forgotten. I think a lot of times Christians want to move beyond the gospel when it comes to the actual sanctification, but we always want to keep coming back to that. Some of the scripture that I see that in is 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians 3. And then through the gospel, believers are adopted into a family, which serves as the context for gospel obedience. I see that in Galatians 4 and Romans 8. And so that would be kind of the second conviction, is community. And then the third conviction would be mission. And this community does not exist for itself, but for the mission of God. And see that in Matthew 28, we see that mission is actually making disciples, but also in Acts 2, as we see the community not just focused inwardly, but also outwardly. And then in Jeremiah 29, as we see the community focused on the good of the city. And so, as I kind of thought through this, I also saw in it just, I guess, some other helpful ideas, and I have that listed right next to each one of those points. So the gospel, I see the motivation for making disciples, and in community, I see the method for making disciples, meaning that we weren't meant to just create disciples individually on our own, which I think a lot of times is our tendency, but we're actually meant to make disciples in community. And then obviously mission then is the mandate. The mandate's to make disciples. We see that most clearly in Matthew 28. And so I just thought that was helpful as I thought through it. Then the next category is cultural analysis. And the question that we're asking here is, what cultural observations shape disciple making? And so then some of the questions that I'm asking of my context, which is Denver, is first, like, what types of people live in Denver? Obviously, Denver's an urban environment. There's a lot of young professionals in Denver. There's also a lot of young families in Denver. We have a variety of social classes represented, just like any major city. Something unique to Denver is we have a extremely large homeless population. I think we actually have one of the largest homeless populations of any city in the United States, and I think that's largely due to the number of social organizations that we have here. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Demographically, 69% are white, 20% Hispanic, 5% African American, 3% Asian. Politically, it's a liberal city, which is interesting because on the whole, Colorado is a pretty conservative state, with the exception of like Boulder and Fort Collins. There's a lot of ranchers and farmers here that kind of contribute to that conservative political mindset. But here in the Denver, it's not really the case. Another question that I'm asking is, what are the customs in Denver? When I say customs, like traditions, rituals, liturgies, Even things like the Broncos season, kind of rhythms in the city change when the Broncos are playing or when they're not. Same thing with the Rockies. A lot of people will take work off or just rearrange their schedules for Rockies games, even though they're terrible. Same thing with the Nuggets. National holidays, obviously, just like most U.S. cities. Something unique to Denver is Western heritage. We actually have the National Western Stock Show that takes place every year, which is the largest stock show of its kind. And that day, the city shuts down and they actually do a cattle drive through 16th Street, which is like an outdoor mall. And that's kind of how the whole thing kicks off. And so that's kind of an interesting characteristic of the city. Oktoberfest, that happens the whole month of October, where major intersections of the city are shut down for Oktoberfest. Cinco de Mayo, which makes sense because of the Hispanic population, and then ski season. That as soon as snow hits the mountains, everyone just kind of disappears, which can be really depressing for a church. Another question I'm asking is, what are the popular values in Denver? These are just a few. There's obviously a lot, but the outdoor lifestyle, that's why a lot of people move here, is so that they have just easy access to the mountains. Social justice is huge here, which, as I mentioned before, is a huge reason for a lot of the homeless population. A lot of organizations that are, seeking to help just kind of different, kind of the marginalized in our city, I guess. And then equality, health, comfort, community and relationship are really felt here. People are always kind of looking for those things, which I think is just kind of universal. People really value mobility. A lot of people don't plan on being in Denver for very long. It's kind of just like a launch pad to the next adventure, the next city, whether that's Seattle or San Francisco or San Diego. So people really don't want to commit to anything. We always joke around that the one thing that people in Denver are committed to is not being committed to anything. Um, People are always trying to work towards financial freedom, so they'll kill themselves, in the short term, so that in the long term they have that freedom, which, as you know, often never comes. People are spiritual, although not religious, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next point. People value diversity here, at least they think they do, but once it actually infringes on their lifestyle and their comfort levels, then they don't like it anymore. Um, People that were very anti-establishment, so there's a huge emphasis on local restaurants, buying local goods, things like that. People are very individualistic and humanistic and relativistic as well. Another question I'm asking: what is the predominant worldview in Denver? And so I would say the predominant worldview, like most cities in North America, is secularism. Where I see it the most in Denver is just this reality that behavior is largely unaffected by belief. People might claim Christianity or even show up to church once in a while, but it has absolutely no bearing on the way that they live their lives the rest of the week. Is what kind of with that, people are okay talking about spiritual things. They're okay talking about God. They're actually very spiritual, but they're not religious. That's kind of their own words. I've heard that a lot in conversations: is I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And so they don't like the organization, the structure, the institutional nature of the church, but they're okay with the spiritual aspects of it, as long as it's not exclusive, which obviously that's where the gospel presents a little bit of offense, but that's okay. Now we're going to look at historical perspective. What historical events and trends should inform disciple making? That's kind of the question I'm asking here. So what is the history of the United States? Well, obviously immigration, religious freedom, slavery, among other things. All those things are very general, but they still have some bearing for the people that are here in Denver. So then I get a little bit more specific and I ask, what is the history of Denver that contributes kind of to the culture here? Obviously, Denver was settled by early American settlers during the Gold Rush period. More recently, there's a lot of transplants in Denver, a lot of those being millennials. It's interesting. You rarely meet someone from Denver or someone that was born here. For some reason, everyone born here left and everyone from other states moved in. Also, a lot of tech startups here in Denver. I think it's been termed the second Silicon Valley or something like that. Basically, people that can't fit in Silicon Valley or get priced out of Silicon Valley come to Denver. So there's a lot of tech startups here. But then more specifically, what is the history of Five Points, which is the neighborhood that I live in, that my church is in, that a lot of our people live in? Um, we have a large heritage of African American people. When the city was kind of settled, a lot of African Americans were working here as agricultural workers and lived in our neighborhood. More recently, gang wars have had a real toll on our neighborhoods and a lot of the racial tension here. Um, and along with that racial tension is, or I guess a contributor to that racial tension would be just the revitalization that's happening in the city and that gentrification as housing prices are rising and as people that have lived here for decades and generations are being priced out of the neighborhoods. That really contributes to the racial tension. Also, a lot of entrepreneurs in the area, in our neighborhood. And then the last question that I'm asking about the culture is what's the history of the church here in Denver? What's that relationship been like between the people of Denver and the church? There's a long history of African American churches here, which isn't surprising. Many of them are still active, which is really cool to see. Many churches here are now repurposed for apartments and condos. So the buildings are still there, but the congregations are non-existent. There's an above average failure rate of new church plants in Denver. There's 63.3% of the people that are unaffiliated with any religious body, 12.2% that are affiliated with an evangelical church, and there's only one SBC church for every 20,000 Denver residents. And the other thing that's kind of surprising here is there's not really a whole lot of church cooperation, whether that be within denominations or even across denominational lines, which is something that we'll talk about more in the strategic formation. So the question that we're asking here is what are effective disciple making strategies? So, given all this information, all this theology, all of these cultural observations, and the historical perspective of the city, what are some practical ways that we can do ministry here and make disciples? So I kind of broke these down into internal and external. Internal strategies I see is one, just church planting. That I know it's obvious, but I think it really is one of the most effective ways to make disciples in a city like Denver. And some of the reasons, or what I mean by that, is as many small congregations rather than a few large congregations. So not one church becoming really big, not even in the sense of like one church having different campuses. And the reason I say that is because Denver is very anti-establishment. And so when a church becomes too big, really when anything becomes too big, it kind of gets put into the category of like Walmart or something like that. And so I think local, diverse, unique expressions of the church are going to be much more effective to making disciples here. Denver's so neighborhood centric that I think churches that really take on the characteristics of those neighborhoods are going to be the most effective in making disciples. Along with that, I see missional communities playing a huge role in disciple making here. And really, churches seeing their missional communities not as a church of missional communities, but rather a church with missional communities. There's a difference there. One being that missional communities is just a program of the church. But actually, I think the most effective strategy would be seeing missional communities as the primary environment for disciple making. And so people really having the feeling that unless they're part of a missional community, like they're not really part of what is happening in that church. And then for external strategies, and when I say that, I mean churches working with organizations and other churches outside of their own. I see cooperation amongst churches, and some of the reasons for that is just there's such a high cost of living in the city, and there's such a premium on space that sharing resources, I think, is just a really effective strategy, whether that be buildings, whether that be staff, whether that be budgets, kind of whatever that looks like. And I think it's really an opportunity for churches to model kingdom priorities. I think when people see churches cooperating that way in a city, they really stop and question. I think that's one of our greatest apologetics. And it's just the way that we love one another. And then lastly, partnerships with other organizations in the city that are already doing a great job. I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we can partner with these organizations that are already making a huge impact. And some of the examples that I've seen is Denver Rescue Mission, and Young Life. Those are two organizations that our church has gotten involved with. So